Hi, I'm Ava Lynn. Welcome to Buddhism in Life, a peaceful space to learn, reflect, and live with mindfulness.
In Buddhism, we often hear about letting go of craving, letting go of constant wanting, letting go of the idea that every discomfort must be fixed immediately. But the Buddha never taught letting go as a theory. He taught it as a practice, lived day by day, through the body, the breath, and ordinary routines. Tonight, we're not entering a Buddhist monastery. We're stepping into an ancient Ethiopian monastic world, one shaped by fasting, silence, and restraint. And yet, as you'll soon notice, the lesson feels deeply familiar. Because when hunger is observed instead of obeyed, when comfort is delayed instead of chased, the mind begins to do what the Buddha pointed to long ago. It settles. This is not a story about religion. It's a story about how letting go actually works in real life. Hey guys, tonight we step into the thin, cool air of Ethiopia's northern highlands, where the land rises and the noise drops away, and where clarity is sometimes pursued by simply not eating. You are walking uphill on a narrow path of red earth, the stones warm from a long day of sun, the sky already fading into that deep blue that makes you feel like bedtime has been waiting for you all along. Somewhere ahead, a monastery clings to rock and silence. The bells are not ringing yet, but you can feel their absence like a held breath. You probably won't survive this, not the lions or the cliffs, but the fasting schedule alone would absolutely ruin your modern snack-based confidence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these nighttime journeys travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are here to learn how ancient Ethiopian monasteries practiced fasting days for clarity, but the clarity doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, like your eyes adjusting to the dark interior of a stone church. The first thing you notice is how quiet everything feels. Not empty quiet, but organized quiet. Even your footsteps seem to behave themselves. Fasting, you're told, is not an occasional challenge here. It is the background setting of life. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian tradition, which took firm shape by the 4th century, fasting is woven into the calendar so deeply that more than half the year can involve some form of food restriction. That's the mainstream historical fact that tends to shock modern listeners, especially those who consider skipping breakfast a radical act. You walk closer to the monastery, and the smell of incense drifts out, mingling with dust and cold stone. A monk passes you, calm, unhurried, and you notice his pace first. It's not slow to be dramatic. It's slow because there's no rush when the body is trained not to expect immediate reward. On fasting days, meals might be limited to a single vegan dish after sunset, or sometimes nothing at all until evening prayers end. Meat, dairy, eggs, gone. Oil, often gone. Your inner voice is already bargaining, but here, bargaining is considered noisy thinking. There's a belief deeply rooted in Ethiopian monastic life that hunger clears the mental fog. When the stomach stops demanding attention, the mind becomes easier to guide. You feel that idea settle in as you sit on a low stone bench, your legs folded, your awareness turning inward whether you asked it to or not. Historians still argue whether this clarity is primarily physiological, linked to metabolic changes, or psychological, shaped by expectation and discipline. The monks, of course, are not especially interested in settling that debate. They're too busy living it. A quirky tidbit floats into your thoughts as you listen to an elder monk explain fasting rules to a novice. Coffee, Ethiopia's most famous export, is traditionally allowed on fasting days. Yes, really. While food is restricted, coffee, often black and strong, is considered acceptable, especially in monastic settings. You imagine explaining that loophole to a modern dietitian and quietly enjoy the confusion. The coffee ceremony itself, slow and deliberate, becomes part of the fasting rhythm, a warm bitterness that sharpens rather than dulls awareness. As night approaches, the temperature drops and hunger becomes more noticeable. Not dramatic hunger, not the kind that sends you spiraling, but a steady presence, like background static. The monks don't fight it, they observe it. This is where letting go begins, not by forcing hunger away, but by allowing it to exist without obeying it. You notice how often your own mind tries to label sensations as problems. Here, sensations are just information. You learn that fasting days are not random acts of endurance. They are scheduled, anticipated, and socially shared. The Ethiopian Orthodox calendar includes weekly fasts on Wednesdays and Fridays, commemorating betrayal and crucifixion, as well as long fasting seasons like Lent. This regularity means fasting is not heroic, it's routine. That's an important distinction. Heroic suffering inflates the ego. Routine restraint slowly deflates it. Historians still argue whether this normalization of hunger created resilience or simply reinforced obedience, but from where you're sitting, it looks like a training ground for patience. A light joke drifts through your tired mind as you listen to an elder monk explain fasting rules. If modern productivity culture saw this setup, it would immediately try to monetize it. Ancient monastic fasting hack for laser focus. You smile and then feel slightly embarrassed by the thought. The monks are not fasting to become more efficient, they are fasting to become less reactive. There's a difference, and it matters. As darkness settles fully, lamps flicker on inside the monastery. The light is soft, uneven, forgiving. You realize that clarity here is not about sharpness alone, it's about gentleness. Fasting strips away excess, but it also exposes what's underneath. Impatience, boredom, quiet joy, they all show up when there's no meal to look forward to at noon. This exposure is intentional. You can't let go of what you never notice. You lie back on a thin mat, listening to distant chanting, your stomach gently reminding you that it exists. The reminder feels less urgent now, almost companionable. You think about how fasting in this context is not punishment, but alignment, body and intention moving in the same direction, even if that direction is simply stillness. Historians still argue whether ancient Ethiopian monks consciously framed fasting as cognitive clarity rather than spiritual obedience, but the lived experience blurs those categories anyway. As sleep begins to edge closer, you hold on to one quiet image, a line of monks walking at dawn, empty hands, steady breath, clear eyes, no rush, no snack, just presence. And you realize that letting go doesn't always mean releasing possessions or thoughts. Sometimes it means releasing the need to constantly fill yourself with something, food, noise, certainty, and trusting that clarity will arrive in the space you leave behind. You wake before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because the cold has opinions. The stone beneath you has spent all night remembering the mountain, and now it shares that memory generously. As you sit up, wrapped in a thin blanket that feels more symbolic than effective, you sense how fasting and environment work together here. Hunger might clear the mind, but cold keeps it awake. You step outside and the sky is just beginning to pale. the kind of light that makes everything feel ancient and unfinished. This is where the roots of Ethiopian monasticism come into focus, not as abstract theology, but as geography and habit. Ethiopian Christianity traces its formal establishment to the 4th century, when King Ezana of Aksum converted and aligned the kingdom with Christian belief. That's the mainstream historical fact you'll find in textbooks, but out here the story feels older, rougher, shaped by caves and cliffs rather than councils. Early monks withdrew into remote landscapes, not to escape the world entirely, but to hear themselves think without interruption. Silence, fasting, and isolation formed a 3-legged stool of clarity. Remove one leg, and the whole thing wobbles. You follow a narrow trail toward a cave chapel, your breath fogging in the air. This is where saints like Abba Pantaleon and Abba Lakanos are said to have lived, figures remembered less for dramatic miracles and more for stubborn devotion. The caves they chose were not comfortable. They were chosen precisely because they were not. Food was scarce, water unreliable, and the body had no illusions about who was in charge. Historians still argue whether this harshness was intentional spiritual engineering or simply a product of available shelter. But either way, fasting fit naturally into the environment. When resources are limited, restraint becomes less a rule and more a rhythm. Inside the cave, the smell changes. Damp stone, smoke residue, old wax. You imagine early monks here, wrapped in rough cloth, eating little more than lentils and bread when they ate at all. Fasting days were frequent and not standardized at first. Some monks fasted alone, others followed local customs, and over time these practices crystallized into communal rules. This gradual codification is important. It suggests fasting wasn't imposed from the top down, but shaped by lived experience. When something works, when it brings clarity, steadiness, or a sense of alignment, it tends to stick. A quirky tidbit slips into your awareness as you trace faded carvings on the cave wall. Some early Ethiopian monks were rumored to fast for 40 days at a time, imitating biblical figures. Whether these accounts are literal or exaggerated is still debated, but the stories themselves mattered. They set a cultural expectation that restraint was admirable, even aspirational. You picture a medieval monk listening to such tales and thinking, "I'll try, maybe not 40 days, but let's see how Tuesday goes." Gentle ambition, monastic edition. As dawn breaks fully, chanting begins. The sound is low, steady, and repetitive, and you notice how fasting changes the way sound lands in the body. When you're not digesting a heavy meal, everything feels slightly sharper, more immediate. The chants seem to pass through you rather than bounce off. This sensory sharpening is one reason fasting became associated with clarity. Without constant digestion, energy feels redirected. Whether that's physiologically accurate or psychologically reinforced is, again, something historians still argue about. The monks would likely shrug and keep chanting. You learn that Ethiopian monasticism developed somewhat independently from European traditions. While there are shared roots in early Christianity, Ethiopian monks emphasized continuity with ancient practices, including dietary laws influenced by Old Testament traditions. This meant fasting wasn't just about spiritual purity, it was about maintaining a lineage. Every fast connected the present moment to centuries of repetition. You feel that weight as something comforting rather than heavy. Routine, when chosen, becomes grounding. A light joke drifts in as you imagine explaining this lifestyle to someone obsessed with biohacking. So, you live in a cave, eat once a day, and chant for hours? Yes, and somehow that's the point. The monks weren't optimizing for performance metrics, they were optimizing for steadiness. There's no leaderboard for inner calm, and that seems to be a relief. You sit again, watching the sun climb higher, and notice how hunger ebbs and flows rather than increasing endlessly. This is something the early monks understood intuitively. Hunger peaks, then softens. Panic does the same. Fasting taught them that discomfort is often temporary, even when it feels urgent. Letting go, in this context, meant letting sensations rise and fall without assigning them permanent meaning. That lesson, learned in a cave centuries ago, still feels uncomfortably relevant. As the morning progresses, work begins: sweeping, carrying water, tending small gardens when available. Fasting does not excuse you from labor, it reframes it. Movements become economical. Conversations are minimal. You notice how clarity here is not loud insight, but a reduction of internal noise. When there's less input, the mind stops juggling. Historians still argue whether Ethiopian monastic fasting was primarily a theological inheritance or a practical adaptation to environment and economy. Standing here, you suspect the answer is both, plus habit. Practices survive when they make sense on multiple levels. Fasting aligned belief, body, and landscape into something coherent. That coherence is what you feel now, even as your stomach gently complains. As noon approaches with no meal in sight, you realize something subtle has shifted. Hunger is no longer the main event, it's just part of the background, like the wind. And in that background, thoughts move more slowly, more honestly. The roots of Ethiopian monasticism were never about escape, they were about staying, with yourself, with discomfort, with clarity that arrives not as a lightning bolt, but as a quiet, steady light. By the time the sun reaches its confident mid-morning position, you've already learned not to ask what time lunch is. There is no lunch. There is, however, a calendar, and it runs your life more thoroughly than any smartphone ever could. You notice it painted faintly on a monastery wall, rows of symbols and saints' names marking days that are not just dates, but instructions. This is where fasting becomes architectural. The calendar doesn't simply tell you when to fast, it tells you who you are today. In Ethiopian monastic life, fasting is not an occasional spiritual reset, it is the default state. Wednesdays and Fridays are fast days nearly year-round, commemorating betrayal and crucifixion, which means 2 days every week already belong to restraint. Then come the longer fasts: Lent, the fast of the Apostles, the fast of the Assumption, the fast of Nineveh. When you add it all up, monks and many lay people traditionally fast well over 180 days a year. That's the mainstream historical fact that tends to short-circuit modern brains. You silently calculate and then stop calculating because it's making you tired. What's surprising is how little drama surrounds these days. No countdowns, no motivational speeches. Fasting days are simply different days. The rhythm of prayer shifts, the work pace adjusts, conversations soften. You feel it immediately. On fast days, the monastery moves as if the air itself is thicker, not sluggish, just intentional. Meals, if they happen at all, arrive after sunset, simple and quiet. Lentils, vegetables, maybe flatbread without oil, nothing that demands excitement. Historians still argue whether this heavy fasting calendar was designed primarily for spiritual purification or for social cohesion. There's evidence for both. When everyone fasts together, hierarchy matters less. The abbot is just as hungry as the novice. The shared experience smooths social friction. You notice this at work assignments. No one complains. Or rather, Everyone complains internally, and no one performs it out loud. Hunger equalizes. A quirky tidbit drifts in as you help sweep a courtyard. On fasting days, some monasteries traditionally avoided even tasting food while cooking for others to prevent accidental indulgence. Imagine preparing a pot of lentils for sunset while absolutely refusing to sample it. This level of restraint sounds heroic until you realize it's also practical. Once you decide tasting is not an option, the temptation disappears. Choice removal is an ancient productivity hack, apparently. As the day unfolds, you realize the calendar doesn't just mark fasting, it marks expectation. On feast days, abundance arrives with equal structure: meat, dairy, celebration, but only on specific days. This contrast is essential. Without feast days, fasting would feel endless. Without fasting days, feasts would feel unearned. The alternation trains perception. You begin to understand that clarity here is not about constant deprivation, but about contrast sharpening awareness. Historians still argue whether feast-fast cycles enhanced gratitude or reinforced control, but the lived experience blends both. A light joke flickers through your mind as you imagine a monk explaining this calendar to a confused traveler. So today we don't eat because Wednesday. The explanation is technically accurate and spiritually useless. Meaning here is cumulative, not explanatory. You don't understand the calendar by reading it, you understand it by living inside it long enough that your body starts predicting tomorrow without asking. Midday prayer arrives, and with it a noticeable dip in energy. You feel it in your legs, in the slight heaviness behind the eyes. This is not treated as a failure, it's expected. Fasting days are designed to expose limits gently. When energy drops, ambition drops with it. You sit more, you listen more, you stop trying to be impressive, which is a relief you didn't know you needed. You overhear a quiet exchange between two monks about whether coffee should be taken today. It's allowed, but opinions differ. Some abstain even from that, others accept it gratefully. There's no enforcement, just guidance. This flexibility surprises you. You expected strictness. Instead, you find calibration. The calendar sets the framework, the individual navigates within it. Historians still argue whether this flexibility weakened discipline or strengthened personal responsibility. Watching the monks, it feels like the latter. As afternoon shadows lengthen, hunger returns briefly, then fades again. You're beginning to trust this pattern. The calendar teaches you that discomfort has a schedule and therefore an end. This knowledge changes how you relate to it. Instead of panicking, you wait. Waiting becomes a skill. Letting go becomes something practiced, not proclaimed. By the time sunset approaches, the calendar's authority feels less external. It has moved inside you. You know when to slow down, when to expect rest, when to anticipate nourishment. The fasting calendar, you realize, is not about controlling behavior, it's about removing constant decision-making. When the decision is already made, the mind quiets. Clarity arrives not because you tried to force it, but because there was finally nothing left to argue about. By now, hunger has stopped being dramatic and started being informative. You notice it the way you notice weather: present, shifting, occasionally inconvenient, but no longer alarming. This is where the monks say the senses begin to wake up, not because food is gone, but because distraction is. Without the usual cycle of eating, digesting, thinking about eating again, your attention spreads out. Sound feels closer. Light seems more specific. Even the texture of air moving across your skin registers with unexpected clarity. You're asked to sit quietly during the afternoon prayer, and this is where fasting's effect on perception becomes undeniable. When the stomach isn't busy, the body feels strangely spacious. Your breathing deepens without instruction. The chanting enters more cleanly, each syllable landing and dissolving without resistance. This sensory sharpening is one of the reasons fasting became associated with mental clarity in Ethiopian monasteries. It wasn't framed as mystical fireworks, but as reduced interference, less input, less noise. The mainstream historical fact tucked into this moment is that Ethiopian monastic prayer schedules were intentionally long and repetitive. Hours of chanting, standing, bowing. On a full stomach, this would be uncomfortable. On a fasting day, it becomes meditative through necessity. You can't rush, you can't fidget much without feeling it, so you settle. Historians still argue whether fasting was designed to support these long prayer cycles or whether prayer adapted to fasting bodies, but either way, the pairing stuck for centuries. A quirky tidbit surfaces as your legs start to complain. Some monasteries believed that fasting reduced not just physical appetite, but intrusive thoughts. There are old sayings suggesting that a hungry stomach leaves no room for unnecessary fantasies. Whether that's literally true or just monastic humor is unclear, but you can't deny that your thoughts feel simpler, not smarter, just fewer. You briefly think about a sandwich, then forget it again. That alone feels like progress. As the afternoon drags gently forward, you're assigned a small task, sorting dried lentils for the evening meal that you may or may not eat. The repetitive motion becomes soothing. Each lentil clicks softly against the bowl. You realize how rarely modern life allows boredom to exist without interruption. Here, boredom is not an emergency, it's a doorway. With nothing urgent to do and no food reward on the horizon, your mind stops scanning for novelty and begins observing itself. Letting go starts to feel less like loss and more like release from constant management. A light joke floats in as you imagine explaining this sensation to a friend back home. "I'm hungry, but in a spiritually productive way." You smirk and immediately feel the smirk dissolve. Humor arises and passes here without needing applause. Even jokes don't linger long. The monks talk quietly about how fasting changes prayer. Words become heavier. You don't rush through them because energy is limited. Each phrase matters. Silence between phrases stretches naturally. This is one of the subtle benefits fasting offers. It forces economy. You don't waste movement, speech, or thought. Everything unnecessary feels expensive. Historians still argue whether this economy leads to deeper insight or simply conditioned restraint, but sitting here, the distinction feels academic. As shadows lengthen again, you notice your senses have adjusted. Hunger hasn't vanished, but it's no longer center stage. Instead, you're aware of birds settling, wind shifting, the smell of smoke from a distant hearth. These details were always present. Fasting didn't create them, it made room for them. That realization lands gently. Clarity, it turns out, is not about adding wisdom, it's about subtracting clutter. You overhear an elder monk explaining to a novice that fasting is meant to expose attachments, not punish the body. If irritation rises, that's the lesson. If pride rises, "Look how disciplined I am," that's also the lesson. Food is simply the trigger. The real work happens in the reaction. This aligns with a broader monastic teaching. You don't fast to become holy, you fast to see what gets in the way of calm. Historians still argue whether early Ethiopian monks articulated this psychology explicitly or absorbed it intuitively, but the practice itself carries the message. Late afternoon brings fatigue, the honest kind. You lie down briefly, not to sleep, but to rest without escaping. This is another rule. Resting is allowed, numbing is not. No food, no entertainment, no busy work to outrun discomfort. Just rest. You notice how different that feels from collapse. The body settles, the mind drifts without scattering. As evening approaches, anticipation quietly grows, not excitement, but readiness. The day has been long, restrained, and strangely full. You realize that your senses feel cleaner, like lenses wiped gently rather than polished aggressively. Hunger has done its work. It has stripped away excess urgency and left behind a softer attention. When the first star appears, you understand why fasting was never just about food. It was about training awareness to stay present when comfort is postponed. That skill, remaining steady without immediate reward, is clarity in its most practical form. And as you sit there, waiting for night prayer to begin, you sense that letting go isn't something you do once, it's something you practice every time you choose not to react. When evening finally arrives, it doesn't announce itself with relief so much as with permission. Lamps are lit, shadows stretch, and the monastery exhales. This is the moment when fasting becomes most visible, not through absence, but through ritualized restraint. You learn quickly that not all fasting days are the same. Some allow a simple meal after sunset, others allow only water. Some permit bread but no oil. The rules sound complex at first, but after living inside them for even a short while, they feel oddly intuitive, like knowing which shoes to wear without checking the weather. Tonight, the meal, if it happens, will be sparse. Bread baked earlier, lentils you helped sort, water drawn carefully and carried without spilling. You notice how the monks approach food with a kind of quiet courtesy. No rushing, no piling. Portions are modest by design. This is where fasting sharpens gratitude, not by starving it into existence, but by slowing it down enough to be noticed. The mainstream historical fact here is that Ethiopian monastic diets have long emphasized plant-based simplicity, especially during fasts, aligning both with religious law and environmental reality. As you sit cross-legged near a low table, waiting for the signal to eat, you notice a curious absence. No one is watching anyone else's plate. Discipline here is assumed, not policed. That trust feels heavier than rules. Historians still argue whether this internalization of restraint was cultivated intentionally or simply emerged over time, but it creates a distinct atmosphere, one where self-control is private and therefore less performative. A quirky tidbit surfaces as an elder monk quietly jokes that fasting days are excellent teachers of portion size. The stomach learns faster than the mind, he says, half smiling. You file that away as both wisdom and gentle threat. When the meal finally begins, the first bite feels almost ceremonial. Texture matters, temperature matters. You chew slowly, partly because there's no rush, partly because your body insists. Hunger has made sensation vivid without making it frantic. You notice something else, too. The meal does not end fullness. It ends hunger enough. That distinction feels important. Modern eating often aims for satisfaction bordering on numbness. Here, eating aims for balance, enough to sustain, not enough to distract. letting go appears again, this time as a refusal to chase excess even when food is finally allowed. Historians still argue whether such moderation was primarily spiritual discipline or practical necessity, but the result is the same: eating without attachment. After the meal, silence returns easily. No post-dinner chatter, no digestion-induced sluggishness. The body feels light, alert, grounded. You understand now why fasting days are paired with evening prayer. The mind is steady, not dulled by fullness. Words land clearly. Silence between them stretches comfortably. Prayer feels less like effort and more like alignment. A light joke floats through your mind. If social media existed here, someone would absolutely post, "Just broke a 14-hour fast with lentils, blessed." You smile, then let the thought go. Humor here is fleeting, like everything else. Nothing needs to be held tightly. As night deepens, you sit outside briefly, watching the stars appear with shocking brightness. Without the usual noise of digestion and distraction, the sky feels closer. This sensory clarity is subtle but persistent. You're not euphoric, you're simply present. Fasting hasn't transported you anywhere mystical, it has anchored you more firmly where you already are. You overhear a quiet conversation about loopholes, how some monks debate whether certain roots count as vegetables, or whether honey breaks a fast. The discussion is gentle, almost playful. This reminds you that fasting is not about rigid perfection, it's about intention. Rules exist to guide attention, not replace it. Historians still argue whether such debates weakened discipline or strengthened communal understanding, but listening to them, it feels like shared curiosity rather than rebellion. As you prepare to sleep again, stomach calm, mind settled, you realize that fasting days end not with triumph, but with normalcy. There's no applause for making it through. Tomorrow may also be a fast or a feast. Either way, the cycle continues. Clarity here is cumulative. It builds quietly through repetition. Lying back on your mat, you feel how the body responds to consistent restraint, not with collapse, but with adaptation. Hunger no longer scares you. Food no longer commands you. This balance between need and desire is the real lesson. Letting go, you realize, isn't about rejecting nourishment. It's about releasing the idea that every urge deserves immediate satisfaction. As sleep approaches, the day settles into memory without sharp edges. You've learned something fundamental without being lectured. That clarity doesn't arrive when everything is added, but when enough is removed to let what remains speak. And tonight, what remains is quiet, steady, and ready to rest. Morning comes again without ceremony, and you notice how the body wakes differently now. There's no heavy residue from last night's meal, no fog to clear, just a gentle awareness that arrives before thought. This is where fasting reveals its social dimension, something easy to miss if you focus only on individual discipline. In the monastery, restraint isn't private heroics, it's shared structure. Everyone wakes into the same conditions, the same expectations, the same mild hunger humming beneath the surface. You move through the courtyard as others emerge from their cells, greeting one another with quiet nods. No one asks how you slept. Sleep is assumed to have happened as well as it could. What matters is that the day begins together. Fasting days shape this sense of communal order. Tasks are assigned with consideration for energy levels. Heavy labor is minimized. Work becomes cooperative rather than competitive. The mainstream historical fact here is that Ethiopian monasteries functioned as tightly organized communities, with fasting days acting as predictable modifiers to daily routines rather than disruptions. You're paired with 2 monks to carry water from a spring downhill. The work is slow, deliberate. No one rushes, because rushing spills water and wastes effort. Hunger reinforces this economy of movement. Every unnecessary step feels louder. You realize how fasting subtly enforces teamwork. When energy is limited, cooperation becomes efficient. Historians still argue whether fasting intentionally fostered communal harmony or simply required it, but the effect is undeniable. People help each other more when everyone is equally restrained. A quirky tidbit surfaces as one monk jokes quietly that fasting days are the easiest days to manage disputes. No one has energy to argue, he says, smiling. You suspect there's truth in that. Emotional reactions soften when the body is slightly humbled. Pride takes more energy than hunger allows. You think about how many modern conflicts might resolve themselves if everyone were just a little less stimulated. It's not a policy recommendation, just a sleepy observation. Back at the monastery, chores continue: sweeping, repairing sandals, copying manuscripts. The hierarchy is present but subtle. Elders guide, novices follow, but fasting blurs the edges. Authority here doesn't come with indulgence. Everyone eats or doesn't eat by the same rules. This shared vulnerability creates trust. You notice how instructions are given gently, without barked orders. When the body is already challenged, there's no need to add friction. Mid-morning prayer gathers everyone again. Standing shoulder to shoulder, you feel how fasting synchronizes breath and posture. Movements slow naturally. No one fidgets much, it costs too much energy. This collective stillness amplifies the chant. The sound feels thicker, more grounded. You sense how clarity here is not an individual achievement, but a group atmosphere. Historians still argue whether communal fasting strengthened social cohesion intentionally or as a byproduct, but listening to the chant, the distinction feels academic. A light joke drifts through your mind as you imagine a corporate team-building retreat adopting fasting days. Trust falls, but with lentils. You suppress a smile and refocus. Humor arises more easily now, but it doesn't stick around. Thoughts pass through without nesting. As the day unfolds, you notice how fasting days reorder time. Without meals to punctuate hours, the day feels longer but less fragmented. Tasks flow into one another. There's less checking, less anticipation. This temporal smoothing reduces anxiety. You're not constantly waiting for the next reward. You're simply present for what's happening. Letting go appears again, this time as release from constant timekeeping. You overhear a discussion about obedience and choice. Fasting is required, yes, but choosing to remain in the monastery is voluntary. This distinction matters. Discipline imposed feels oppressive. Discipline chosen feels stabilizing. Historians still argue how voluntary monastic life truly was in different periods, but within these walls, the sense of consent is palpable. People stay because the structure supports them, not because they're trapped. In the afternoon, fatigue returns, but it's communal fatigue. Everyone moves a little slower. No one apologizes for it. This shared pacing reduces comparison. You're not behind, you're not ahead, you're simply in sync. That synchronization is a form of clarity rarely discussed. When everyone operates at the same tempo, friction drops. Silence fills the gaps. As evening approaches again, you realize that fasting days teach not just restraint, but coordination. Body, mind, and community align around a common limitation. Instead of fighting that limitation, the monastery organizes around it. This organization is gentle, flexible, and surprisingly kind. You sit quietly, watching others prepare for evening prayer. Hunger is present, but it's no longer personal. It belongs to the day itself, and in that shared experience, you feel oddly supported. Letting go, you understand now, isn't just about releasing attachment to food, it's about releasing the illusion that you have to manage everything alone. By the seventh day you experience here, fasting again, of course, you start noticing how often monks talk about the body without sounding obsessed by it. The conversation isn't about appearance or performance. It's about balance, digestion, heat, breath, sleep. Ancient Ethiopian monasteries inherited a medical worldview that blended biblical thought, local tradition, and Greco-Arabic humoral ideas that filtered in through trade routes. That's the mainstream historical fact anchoring today's quiet observations. Fasting was not only spiritual discipline, but a form of bodily regulation. You sit near an elder who explains, gently and without drama, that fasting cools excess heat in the body. Heat, in this worldview, is associated with agitation, impulsiveness, and scattered thinking. Reducing food, especially rich food, was believed to calm this inner fire. Whether or not modern physiology agrees completely, you can't deny the experiential side. You feel calmer, less reactive. The body, slightly deprived, becomes more conservative with energy. Historians still argue whether these medical explanations were symbolic metaphors or earnest physiological theories, but for the monks, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that fasting felt clarifying. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen. Some monasteries once timed fasts to lunar cycles, believing moon phases influenced digestion and mental state. The idea sounds mystical until you remember how many cultures once coordinated health practices with the sky. You imagine a monk looking up at the moon and deciding tonight was a good night to skip dinner. Somehow, that feels less absurd than it should. During mid-morning prayer, your stomach makes a small, traitorous sound. No one reacts. This lack of reaction teaches you something important. Bodily signals are acknowledged but not dramatized. Hunger exists, so does thirst, so does fatigue. None of them are emergencies unless you decide they are. This attitude reframes the body not as an enemy to overcome, but as a partner to listen to calmly. Letting go appears again, this time as release from panic. Later, you're asked to help prepare herbs used for minor ailments. Some are brewed as teas, others dried for later use. You learn that fasting days were often paired with lighter medicinal remedies, under the belief that the body absorbs treatment more effectively when digestion is not overloaded. Historians still argue whether fasting truly enhanced medicinal efficacy or whether the perceived benefits were placebo effects layered onto belief. Watching the careful preparation, you suspect belief itself was part of the medicine. A light joke drifts through your mind as you imagine modern wellness influencers discovering this. Ancient Ethiopian monks did it first. You smile, then let the thought pass. The monks aren't interested in novelty, they're interested in steadiness. As afternoon arrives, you notice how your mind responds differently to discomfort now. Hunger triggers curiosity rather than irritation. You observe how it rises, plateaus, fades. This observational stance is central to monastic clarity. Fasting creates predictable discomfort, which becomes a training ground for awareness. When the body complains, you don't argue, you listen. Historians still argue whether this practice cultivated genuine mindfulness or simply conditioned endurance. but from inside the experience, the line feels thin. You overhear a conversation about sleep. Fasting days often produce lighter, shorter sleep, but also more vivid dreams. Some monks consider this a side effect, others consider it useful. Dreams, they believe, reveal what the waking mind avoids. Eating less seems to loosen mental filters. You make a mental note, wondering what your own dreams might do tonight. As evening approaches, you feel the familiar, quiet anticipation. The body has learned the rhythm. Hunger is no longer novel, it's almost polite. You realize that fasting in this context trains not deprivation, but trust. Trust that the body will not collapse simply because comfort is delayed. That trust extends into other areas. If you can survive hunger calmly, you can survive uncertainty calmly too. You sit during evening prayer, breath steady, mind unhurried. The chants feel less like words and more like vibration. This sensory clarity, subtle, steady, is the outcome monks point to when they talk about fasting for clarity. Not visions, not revelations, just a cleaner channel between experience and awareness. As night settles, you reflect on how ancient medical beliefs, whether accurate or symbolic, gave fasting a practical rationale. It wasn't just obedience, it was care. Care for the body as an instrument of attention. Letting go, you realize, sometimes begins with trusting that your body doesn't need constant indulgence to function wisely. You start noticing the women once you stop assuming they're absent. At first, your mind quietly buys into the familiar image of monastic life as male, cloistered, uniform. But that assumption dissolves the longer you stay. Ethiopian monastic history includes women, ascetics, widows, hermits, who practiced fasting with the same intensity, often with less recognition. Their presence isn't loud, it's woven into the edges of the story, like stitching you only see when you look closely. You hear about debteras and holy women who lived near monasteries rather than inside them, attached but not enclosed. Widows, in particular, held a respected role in Ethiopian religious life. Many adopted ascetic practices voluntarily after their husbands' deaths, including strict fasting schedules. This is the mainstream historical fact often overlooked. Fasting in Ethiopia was not confined to monks alone. It extended into lay religious life, especially among women who chose devotion over remarriage. For them, fasting offered both spiritual clarity and social independence in a world with limited options. You meet an elderly woman who brings water and herbs to the monastery. She doesn't speak much, but when she does, it's precise. She's been fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays for decades, long after her children grew up. No one forced her, no one supervises her. Fasting, for her, has become a quiet structure that holds the day together. You notice how naturally she moves, conserving energy, choosing words carefully. Clarity here doesn't announce itself, it settles. A quirky tidbit emerges as you listen to a monk recount local stories. Some female ascetics were believed to fast so strictly that they survived on communion bread alone for long stretches. Whether these accounts are literal, symbolic, or politely exaggerated is unclear. Historians still argue whether such stories reflect actual practice or functioned as moral exemplars meant to inspire restraint. Either way, the stories mattered. They offered women a spiritual vocabulary of strength that didn't rely on physical dominance or public authority. You realize that fasting provided women with a socially acceptable reason to limit domestic labor. On fast days, expectations softened. Cooking less, eating less, speaking less, these were not seen as laziness but as devotion. That shift in expectation mattered. It created pockets of autonomy inside rigid social roles. Letting go, in this context, wasn't abstract. It was practical. It meant releasing constant service without needing to justify it. A light joke drifts through your mind as you imagine trying to explain this to a modern productivity guru. She optimized by eating less and talking less. Somehow, it sounds ridiculous and profound at the same time. You let the thought pass, noticing how fasting has made humor gentler too, less sharp, less performative. You sit quietly as evening approaches, thinking about how clarity looks different depending on who's allowed to practice it. Male monks had monasteries and written histories. Women often had memory, ritual, and repetition. Fasting was one of the few practices fully accessible to both. It required no property, no education, no permission, just commitment. Historians still argue whether women's fasting was valued equally or merely tolerated, but the endurance of the practice suggests it held real meaning. You observe how the woman you met earlier eats when food is allowed, slowly, deliberately, without apology. There's no guilt, no compensatory overeating. Fasting hasn't turned into fixation, it's become background rhythm. You realize that clarity here isn't about control, it's about familiarity. When restraint is familiar, it stops feeling like deprivation. As night deepens, you think about how many spiritual histories overlook these quieter figures. Fasting kept them visible to themselves, even if history forgot them. It anchored identity when external recognition was scarce. Letting go, for these women, meant releasing the need to be seen in order to be steady. You lie down, stomach calm, thoughts unhurried. The monastery settles around you again. Somewhere nearby, a woman you may never hear named again prepares for another fasting day tomorrow, and in that anonymity there's a strange kind of clarity too, living a disciplined, meaningful life without needing an audience. You wake to wind again, but this time it carries something sharper: height. Today you climb. The path narrows, the air thins, and the monastery you're approaching doesn't sit politely on the land, it grips it. Rock-hewn churches and cliffside sanctuaries define some of Ethiopia's most striking monastic spaces, and fasting takes on a different texture here. Isolation amplifies everything. Hunger feels louder. Silence feels deeper. Thought echoes. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this ascent is that many Ethiopian monasteries were intentionally built in remote, difficult-to-access locations, on plateaus, inside cliffs, atop steep escarpments. Lalibela is the famous example, but countless lesser-known sites exist, carved into rock faces or perched on near-vertical terrain. These locations weren't chosen for convenience. They were chosen because effort filters intention. If you made it up here, you meant to be here. As you climb, you feel hunger more sharply than usual. Elevation does that. Breath shortens. The body demands efficiency. Every step becomes deliberate. This is where fasting and geography form a feedback loop. Hunger slows you. The terrain demands slowness. Together, they enforce attention. Historians still argue whether these extreme locations were selected primarily for symbolic separation from the world or for practical defense and privacy. But fasting fits both interpretations. When reaching food requires effort, restraint stops feeling optional. You enter a rock-cut chapel, cool and dim, the walls bearing centuries of soot and prayer. Inside, the silence feels heavy, not oppressive, but concentrated. Fasting in isolation shifts psychological effects. Without communal rhythm to soften it, hunger turns inward faster. Thoughts surface more clearly. Memories wander in without invitation. This is intentional. Isolation removes social distraction. Fasting removes sensory distraction. What's left is the mind, unbuffered. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you rest near the entrance. Some monks living in extreme isolation reportedly lowered baskets on ropes to receive food on non-fasting days, minimizing contact. On fasting days, the basket simply stayed empty. Whether this was common practice or legendary embellishment is debated, but the image sticks, a basket rising and falling as a visible measure of restraint. As the day progresses, you notice your inner commentary grow louder, then quieter. First comes negotiation, then irritation, then, surprisingly, calm. This arc is familiar now. Fasting exposes mental habits quickly in isolation because there's nowhere to redirect attention. You can't chat, you can't help with chores. You sit, you notice. Letting go becomes unavoidable. You either release the urge to escape discomfort or you wrestle with it endlessly. A light joke flickers through your mind. Modern silent retreats charge thousands for what this cliff provides for free, assuming you don't count the climbing. You smile faintly, then return to stillness. Humor appears, bows, and exits without applause. You learn that some monks chose these extreme settings specifically to intensify fasting's effects. Hunger alone was not enough. Hunger plus silence plus altitude created conditions for deep introspection. Historians still argue whether such extremity produced clarity or simply psychological strain, but monastic writings suggest both were expected outcomes. Strain was not failure, it was information. As afternoon light slants through the chapel opening, shadows stretch and soften. Hunger returns briefly, sharper than before, then fades. The mind follows the same pattern. Agitation rises, then dissolves. You notice how little effort this takes now. Earlier in the journey, you fought sensations. Here, you observe them. Fasting has trained you not to interfere unnecessarily. You think about how isolation changes the meaning of food. In communal settings, meals are social anchors. Here, food is purely functional. On fasting days, its absence removes even that anchor. What remains is awareness without reference points. This can feel unsettling or liberating, depending on how tightly you cling to routine. Letting go here means releasing the need for constant markers, time, meals, conversation, to tell you who you are. As evening approaches, the temperature drops quickly. Hunger fades into cold awareness. You wrap yourself tighter and sit. Prayer here is quieter, shorter. Words feel heavier in thin air. You don't speak much, you don't need to. Clarity doesn't announce itself. It settles like dust after a long climb. When darkness finally closes in, you lie back, listening to wind move across stone. You realize that fasting in isolation strips life down to essentials: breath, warmth, and awareness. Everything else is optional. That realization doesn't feel dramatic, it feels honest. And as sleep edges closer, you understand why some monks chose this intensity, not to escape the world, but to see themselves without cushioning. When the fasting season finally breaks, it doesn't shatter the silence, it bends it. You wake to a different kind of anticipation in the air, subtle, controlled, almost cautious. Today is a feast day. Not indulgence, not chaos, just permission. This contrast is intentional, and it's one of the most revealing parts of Ethiopian monastic fasting. Feast days are not rewards, they are tests of a different kind. The mainstream historical fact guiding this shift is that Ethiopian Orthodox tradition carefully balances fasting with feasting. Major feast days, celebrating saints, resurrection, or major events, allow meat, dairy, oil, and abundance. These days are just as regulated as fasts. The food changes, but the discipline does not disappear. That's important. Without feast days, fasting would turn brittle. Without fasting days, feasts would lose meaning. Together, they form a cycle that trains flexibility rather than fixation. You notice the change immediately in the kitchen area. More movement, more preparation, more aroma. Meat simmers, butter appears, spices bloom in warm air. Hunger responds with enthusiasm, but not desperation. Your body remembers restraint. You don't rush. No one does. This is where clarity reveals itself most clearly, when abundance arrives and you don't lunge for it. Historians still argue whether feast days reinforced hierarchy or relieved social pressure, but watching the monks, it feels like a controlled release rather than a reversal. A quirky tidbit floats up as an elder mentions that some monks found feast days more challenging than fasts. Excess, not absence, tested discipline. It's easy to be restrained when there's nothing to take. It's harder when everything is available. You feel that truth as you sit before a fuller plate than you've seen in days. The smell alone feels overwhelming. You breathe. You wait. A light joke drifts through your mind. You've trained all week for this meal, like a spiritual endurance event, and now the real challenge begins. Stopping at enough. You smile faintly and begin eating slowly. Each bite lands differently. Richness feels heavier. Pleasure arrives quickly, then asks to be managed. Letting go here means releasing the urge to maximize enjoyment. You stop when hunger stops, not when the plate empties. You notice how the monks talk more on feast days, but not much more. Laughter appears briefly, then settles. The rhythm remains intact. Feasts are celebrations, not escapes. This steadiness surprises you. Modern culture often treats indulgence as permission to abandon structure. Here, structure holds indulgence gently, preventing it from tipping into chaos. Historians still argue whether this balance was consciously designed or evolved through trial and error, but the effect is clear. Feast days recalibrate desire. They remind you that pleasure is not the enemy of clarity, attachment is. Eating well does not undo fasting's lessons if done attentively. In fact, it completes them. As the day progresses, energy lifts slightly. Work resumes with more vigor. The body responds positively, but not wildly. You notice how quickly normality returns. The feast does not derail the routine. This is another subtle teaching. Nourishment supports clarity when it doesn't dominate attention. Food becomes fuel again, not entertainment. In the afternoon, you walk quietly, digesting both food and insight. The contrast between fasting and feasting sharpens understanding. Fasting teaches you how little you need. Feasting teaches you how much is enough. Together, they train discernment. Historians still argue whether this cycle produced long-term psychological resilience or merely short-term discipline, but standing here, you feel steadier than before. As evening arrives, there's no regret, no heaviness. You don't wish the feast had lasted longer. You don't dread the next fast. The cycle feels natural now. Letting go, you realize, isn't about clinging to restraint or indulgence. It's about moving between them without losing balance. You sit as night settles.
body warm, mind calm. The feast has passed, leaving no residue of urgency. Tomorrow may be another fast, or not. Either way, you're no longer bracing against it. You've learned that clarity survives both hunger and fullness, as long as you don't confuse either with identity.
The rhythm you've settled into begins to widen as you notice who lives beyond the monastery walls. Fasting here does not exist in isolation from the surrounding world. Ethiopian monasteries have always shared space, geographically and culturally, with Muslim communities, Jewish Beta Israel traditions, and local spiritual practices that long predate Christianity. On fasting days, you start to see how porous these boundaries really are. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this observation is that Ethiopia has been home to significant Muslim populations since the 7th century, when early followers of Islam sought refuge here. This long coexistence meant daily life involved constant negotiation: markets, water sources, festivals. Fasting practices inevitably brushed up against one another. You notice how familiar the rhythm feels. Muslim neighbors fast during Ramadan, monks fast during Lent. Different theology, similar discipline. Hunger, it turns out, is multilingual. You walk toward a nearby village and hear the call to prayer drifting on the air, overlapping softly with church bells. No one flinches. This overlap is normal. Fasting days sometimes align, sometimes don't, but the shared experience of restraint creates an unspoken understanding. You realize that fasting becomes a cultural bridge. When everyone is a little hungry, empathy comes easier. Historians still argue whether this overlap fostered tolerance or merely coexistence, but the everyday calm suggests something functional worked. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen to a monk recount trade interactions. On market days during fasting seasons, certain foods simply weren't sold openly. Demand dropped. Vendors adapted. Entire local economies adjusted to religious calendars. Imagine a modern city quietly agreeing not to sell cheeseburgers 2 days a week. The coordination alone feels miraculous. You notice similarities in language, too. Words for patience, restraint, and cleanliness echo across traditions. Fasting is often framed as purification, not just of the body, but of intention. This shared vocabulary smooths interaction. When a Muslim neighbor declines food, no explanation is required. When a monk does the same, no offense is taken. Letting go appears here as release from the need to justify yourself constantly. A light joke drifts through your mind. Hunger, apparently, is the most reliable interfaith dialogue facilitator. You smile and let it go. Humor here remains gentle, unforced. As afternoon approaches, you observe how fasting days quiet social friction. Disputes are postponed, negotiations soften. Everyone moves a little slower, speaks a little less. Historians still argue whether fasting actively reduced conflict or simply delayed it, but from where you stand, even delay feels valuable. Not every disagreement needs immediate resolution. Some benefit from space. You sit near a shaded wall, listening to conversations blend and separate. The monastery does not retreat from the world on fasting days, it synchronizes with it differently. This synchronization creates resilience. When hardship arrives, drought, conflict, uncertainty, communities already know how to function with less. Fasting trains adaptability long before crisis demands it. As evening approaches, you reflect on how fasting operates beyond doctrine. It's a shared human experience that transcends labels. When food is absent, hierarchy softens. When appetite quiets, listening increases. Letting go, you realize, isn't only personal, it's communal. It's the willingness to meet others in simplicity rather than excess. As night settles, lamps glow again. Somewhere nearby, another community breaks a fast in a different way, with different words, but similar relief. You lie back, stomach calm, mind open. The day has shown you that clarity doesn't belong to one tradition. It emerges wherever restraint is practiced with intention and shared without fear. The longer you stay, the more you hear quiet disagreement, never loud, never hostile, just persistent questions moving slowly through centuries. Fasting, you realize, was never universally agreed upon, even here. Some monks embraced extreme restraint, others warned against it. Ethiopian monastic history includes long-running debates about how much fasting was enough, how much was too much, and who got to decide the difference. This tension doesn't weaken the tradition, it gives it depth. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this section is that Ethiopian church councils and monastic leaders periodically issued guidance to rein in excessive asceticism. Records describe elders cautioning younger monks against fasting that weakened the body beyond usefulness. The goal, they insisted, was clarity, not collapse. That distinction mattered. Fasting was meant to support prayer and awareness, not replace them. Historians still argue whether these interventions were compassionate corrections or attempts to standardize control, but the conversations themselves reveal a living tradition, not a rigid one. You sit with a group of monks as they discuss stories of legendary ascetics who fasted relentlessly, living on almost nothing for years. The stories are told with admiration, but also caution. Not everyone is built the same, one monk says quietly. This acknowledgement surprises you. You expected uniform expectations. Instead, you find discernment. Extremity is respected, but not demanded. Letting go appears here as release from comparison. You don't need to outfast anyone. A quirky tidbit surfaces as someone mentions monks who secretly ate extra food while publicly maintaining severe fasts. When discovered, the issue wasn't the eating, it was the secrecy. Deception, not nourishment, was the problem. This detail lingers. It suggests that honesty mattered more than performance. Historians still argue whether such stories were moral lessons or actual disciplinary records, but they underline a key value: clarity requires transparency. A light joke drifts through your mind. Even monks can't out-discipline human biology forever. You smile faintly. The smile passes, the point remains. As the day unfolds, you notice how debates about fasting mirror debates about spirituality everywhere. Where is the line between dedication and harm, between letting go and self-erasure? These questions don't get final answers. They're revisited across generations. Fasting becomes the testing ground where theory meets flesh. The body reports back honestly, even when ideology wants it silent. You hear that some monasteries adjusted fasting rules seasonally, easing restrictions during times of heavy labor or illness. This flexibility surprises you again. Discipline here is adaptive, not brittle. Historians still argue whether this adaptability weakened tradition or ensured its survival. But standing among monks who've practiced for decades, the survival argument feels convincing. In the afternoon, fatigue visits you again, familiar now. You don't label it failure, you don't dramatize it. You sit, you breathe, you let it be.
This non-reactivity feels like the real fruit of fasting, not heroic endurance, but calm response. Letting go, you realize, sometimes means letting the body speak without arguing back. As evening approaches, the debates fade into background hum. What remains is practice. Eat or don't eat, pray or rest. Adjust tomorrow if needed. The clarity fasting offers doesn't come from rigid answers. It comes from honest engagement with limits. And as you lie down, body tired but steady, you feel grateful that this tradition allowed room for questioning. Clarity, it turns out, grows best where certainty loosens its grip.
When outsiders finally arrive in larger numbers, they bring notebooks, assumptions, and appetites of a different kind. European travelers and missionaries in the 19th and early 20th centuries encounter Ethiopian monasteries and immediately start misunderstanding the fasting. They see thin bodies and long fasts and translate them through their own lenses: poverty, backwardness, inefficiency. You can almost hear the mental arithmetic. Less food equals less productivity. Case closed. The mainstream historical fact grounding this moment is that European colonial powers never fully colonized Ethiopia, but they documented it extensively. Travelogues, missionary reports, and diplomatic accounts often described Ethiopian fasting practices with a mix of fascination and concern. Fasting was framed as excessive, irrational, or unhealthy, especially when compared to emerging Western nutritional science. These accounts said more about European anxieties than Ethiopian realities. You sit with an elder monk who recalls stories passed down about early encounters. Visitors would arrive with gifts of food, insisting monks eat properly. When monks declined, the visitors worried aloud about strength and sanity. The misunderstanding ran both ways. Monks saw visitors constantly eating, snacking, stimulating themselves with sugar and alcohol, and quietly wondered how their minds ever rested. Historians still argue whether these encounters led to meaningful exchange or mostly mutual misreading, but the tension was real. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you hear about missionaries who tried to introduce regular meal schedules to monastic communities: breakfast, lunch, dinner, 3 anchors a day. The monks listened politely, nodded, and returned to their fasting calendar once the visitors left. The body had already learned a different rhythm. You imagine the frustration on both sides and feel a small smile rise and fade. As colonial influence crept closer in other parts of Africa, Ethiopian fasting became a point of cultural resistance. Maintaining traditional restraint practices was not just spiritual, it was identity preservation. Eating differently became a quiet assertion of autonomy. Letting go here meant refusing to absorb external judgments about what a healthy or modern body should look like. Historians still argue whether fasting functioned consciously as resistance or simply persisted out of continuity, but persistence itself became a statement. A light joke flickers through your mind: nothing confuses outsiders faster than a community that deliberately eats less when offered more. You suppress a grin and keep listening. You notice how these misunderstandings linger even today. Modern observers often frame fasting either as dangerous extremism or trendy wellness. Both miss the point. Fasting in Ethiopian monastic life was never about optimization, it was about orientation, turning attention inward, reducing dependency on constant input. Colonial narratives struggled with this because they measured value in output. Monastic life measured value in steadiness. As evening approaches, you reflect on how clarity can be culturally invisible. If you don't share the values that produce it, you won't recognize it when you see it. European observers looked for progress and found none. Ethiopian monks looked for peace and found it daily. Historians still argue whose criteria mattered more, but lying here, listening to the wind again, you feel confident which metric feels more livable. Night settles gently. The monastery hasn't changed to accommodate outside misunderstanding, and that continuity feels intentional. Letting go, you realize, sometimes means letting go of the need to be understood at all. Morning light arrives carrying a faint electrical hum you didn't notice before. A wire runs along a wall. Somewhere, a phone charges quietly. You've crossed an invisible line into the present. Ethiopian monasteries still fast, still chant, still rise before dawn, but now they do so alongside generators, solar panels, and occasional notifications. Modernity didn't replace fasting, it learned to coexist with it, awkwardly at first, then more naturally. The mainstream historical fact grounding this moment is that many Ethiopian monasteries today actively negotiate tradition within contemporary life. Monks travel to cities, manage land disputes, answer phones, and return to fasting schedules unchanged. Electricity arrived, calendars stayed. This coexistence wasn't seamless, but it was deliberate. Fasting, elders insisted, was not optional heritage. It was functional training for attention in an increasingly noisy world. You sit with a younger monk who admits that fasting feels harder now, not because bodies have changed, but because temptation has multiplied. Screens offer distraction, food is more available, comparison is constant. Yet he also says fasting feels more necessary than ever. Hunger cuts through noise. When notifications fade and the stomach is empty, the mind still knows what to do. Historians still argue whether fasting remains psychologically effective under modern conditions, but the monks practicing it daily seem unconvinced by the doubt. A quirky tidbit surfaces as he explains that some monasteries now use fasting days as intentional offline days. Phones are turned off unless necessary, communication slows, the ancient restraint adapts. You imagine monks accidentally discovering digital detox centuries before it became a buzzword and feel a soft smile rise. A light joke drifts through your mind. Fasting from food was apparently just phase 1. Fasting from Wi-Fi is the advanced level. You let the humor pass, noticing how even jokes feel quieter now. As the day unfolds, you observe how fasting intersects with modern health conversations. Doctors sometimes caution against long fasts. Monks listen respectfully, then contextualize. Fasting here is not extreme deprivation. It is structured, predictable, and socially supported. Historians still argue whether modern medical frameworks can fully evaluate practices designed for different goals, but the monks' calm persistence suggests lived evidence carries weight. In the afternoon, you watch a monk check messages briefly, then return to prayer. The transition is smooth. No agitation, no lingering pull. Fasting seems to buffer against overstimulation. When the body expects less, the mind demands less. Letting go here becomes adaptability, holding tradition without freezing it, meeting the present without surrendering to it. As evening arrives, the familiar hunger returns. Nothing about modernity has changed that. What has changed is context. Hunger now exists alongside choice. You could eat. You choose not to. That choice feels heavier and therefore more clarifying. Restraint is meaningful only when indulgence is easy. You sit again as lamps glow. Some are electric now, some still flicker. The chant begins, unchanged. You realize that fasting's deepest lesson survives modernization intact. Clarity does not depend on conditions, it depends on relationship, how you relate to sensation, impulse, and time. As night settles, you feel the steadiness you've cultivated carry you gently toward rest. Tomorrow may bring messages, obligations, decisions. Tonight brings silence, and fasting, ancient and adaptable, has done what it always did, made room.
You wake on what feels like a quieter morning, not because the monastery is different, but because you are. Hunger still exists. The calendar still marks fasts and feasts. The bells still ring when they always have. But something in your relationship to all of it has softened. You are no longer bracing against fasting. You are moving with it. This is where the idea of letting go finally settles into the body as habit rather than concept. Ancient Ethiopian monasteries never treated fasting as a dramatic spiritual statement. It was never framed as self-denial for its own sake. It was practiced as training in release. Release from immediacy, release from constant consumption, release from the belief that every signal from the body or mind requires instant response. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this realization is simple. Fasting endured in Ethiopian monastic life for over a millennium, not because it was extreme, but because it was sustainable. Practices that collapse, people disappear. Practices that quietly reshape behavior remain. Fasting stayed because it taught monks how to live with less without becoming smaller. Historians still argue whether its success lies more in theology, psychology, or social structure, but endurance itself is evidence. You sit outside as morning light spreads slowly, noticing how your attention no longer hunts for stimulation. There's nothing to optimize, nothing to fix. Hunger rises, pauses, fades. Thoughts do the same. You recognize this pattern now. It no longer surprises you. Letting go, you realize, isn't a single moment of surrender. It's a repeated decision not to interfere unnecessarily. A quirky tidbit floats back into memory, how fasting days once shaped entire markets, kitchens, conversations. You see now that fasting didn't remove people from life, it reorganized life around awareness rather than appetite. That reorganization is subtle but powerful. It shifts the center of gravity inward. A light joke drifts through your mind. After all this, the biggest lesson might be that clarity is incredibly boring to chase and deeply satisfying to live. You smile gently and let the thought dissolve. As the day unfolds, you notice how fasting has recalibrated your sense of enough. Enough food, enough words, enough thought. This recalibration is the quiet gift of restraint. It doesn't make life smaller, it makes it less crowded. Historians still argue whether such practices are transferable outside monastic contexts, but sitting here, you suspect the principle travels even if the form doesn't. You prepare to leave the monastery in your mind, even if not physically. The path downward looks the same as when you arrived, but you know it will feel different. You'll carry this rhythm with you, not the exact fasting calendar, not the rules, but the relationship, the willingness to pause before reacting,
the trust that discomfort passes, the knowledge that clarity arrives when you stop stuffing every space with something. As evening approaches one last time in this journey, the monastery settles into its familiar stillness. Lamps glow, chanting begins, hunger hums softly, no longer demanding attention. You lie back, breathing slow and steady, feeling how natural this calm now feels. And now, as promised, the story loosens its grip. The night grows quieter. The details blur gently at the edges. The mountains fade into shadow. The calendar pages stop turning. There is no fasting day or feast day anymore, only breath rising and falling at its own pace. Your body knows what to do. Your mind doesn't need to solve anything. You don't have to hold on to the story. You can let it go. The silence becomes softer, warmer. Thoughts drift like clouds and thin out. Hunger is just a distant echo, harmless, unimportant. You rest in the space that fasting revealed but never tried to fill, the space where clarity lives quietly, without effort. Stay here as long as you like. In Buddhist teaching, clarity doesn't come from adding more ideas. It comes from seeing clearly what is already here: sensation, impulse, reaction. What these fasting monks show us, across culture and tradition, is something the Buddha emphasized again and again. Suffering doesn't come from hunger, noise, or discomfort themselves. It comes from the urgent need to push them away. When restraint becomes familiar, when discomfort is allowed to rise and fall without panic, the mind stops clinging. This is not asceticism. It's not punishment. It's training. The same training the Buddha described as learning to be at ease with things as they are. So as you rest here tonight, remember, letting go doesn't mean rejecting life. It means trusting that you don't need to grasp every moment for it to be enough.
Buddhism in life. Learn the Buddha's way. Cultivate humanity.